Now we want to go over the fundamentals of our stance. We've already talked about our grip. We want to talk about getting a good postured stance. People will argue back and forth that the stance is less important because if you'll hear the saying that if you're in a great stance, you're not utilizing cover properly. Well, no, I guess that's true. What happens if you don't have cover to utilize? Furthermore, with a new shooter, I find it completely just vital that they minimize the amount of variation within things that they're shooting. Controlling those variables allows them to work on the fundamentals, like grip, like trigger control, all the 7 fundamentals of shooting. It allows them to work on it, minimizing the variations of change. So I do understand that if you're shooting underneath a vehicle and you're in a prone position, that yes, you are not in a good stance. I got that. But for the situation when you can be in a good stance, I think it's very important. So here's how we go about doing that. First thing that I want to do is I want to be bent slightly at the knees and my shoulders slightly in front of my waist. Especially with female shooters, for some reason, when they shoot, they want to keep getting further away from the firearm until they're leaning backwards. And that's the opposite. I want your posture leaning slightly forwards. Okay, my shoulders should be out just in front of my waist, just in front of my knees in this position. That's true with a rifle, handgun, shotgun, whatever. This is the position that I want to be in. My knees are bent, my hips are slightly forward, my shoulders in front of my hips. I'm leaning forward just a little bit. Now, also, I want the weight slightly in front of my, slightly on the front half of my toes here. I'm not up on my toes or anything like that, but from this position, when I push the firearm out, I want to be in the situations where as I shoot, I'm controlling the firearm. So when I come in from this position, I want to be able to make sure that I'm absorbing the recoil in my elbows, like we talked about with grip, and I'm absorbing that in the most center line of my mass as possible, understanding that it will have to be slightly offset because your right eye or left eye dominant. So, but as close to my center line as possible, absorbing the recoil in my elbows and having my shoulders in a good stance, good posture, able to engage targets multiple times without having long splits in between my follow-up shots. Now, one way that I like to think about that is if you were to get on a door or a door frame and lean forward to where you could hold yourself and then take your hand away without falling, that's the break point that you should be at, to where you could just barely hold yourself without falling. Okay, that's about the amount of bend that I'd like to have in a forward position. Some people will say drive the gun. Driving the gun, I like the term drive the firearm, but what I don't want you to think about is when you're coming out of holster, driving the gun out. Because you'll watch how the muzzle during that end snap will overcompensate and shake. And then it's hard for you to get your initial shot on target. When I say drive the gun, I think about it more of a stance of not just driving like a car, but in football, if you're hitting something and you're driving it, you're driving your feet forward and you're pushing. That's what I'm thinking about with a firearm. I want to be in that stance where I'm driving the gun forward so that as I turn, I have good targets. Now, I understand that if you're, for instance, if this were cover and I'm trying to utilize cover and I'm leaned out to the side engaging targets, that no, I don't have that option. And you're going to have to modify your stance a good bit. From there, grip does become much more important. So, but I can still have the basic fundamentals. If you think about the isosceles stance, there's isosceles triangles. One would be your arms. You're making a triangle. Another one would be from your head to your feet. That's another triangle. Another triangle could be argued from your feet to the extension of your hands, leaning forward. Okay? That's where the isosceles term comes from for that stance. The other stance that we're going to cover is called the Weaver stance. Named after Jack Weaver, who was a deputy in Los Angeles, made this stance very popular, and I believe the FBI even adopted it in the early 80s as one of their taught stances. But basically, in the days where police officers were shooting competitions like this, there was a man named Jack Weaver who came in and shot more of a rifle stance like this. And with a Weaver stance, you have one foot, your non-shooting hand, that foot, so in this case my left foot, forward of my right foot. I have my right arm almost locked out, acting basically like a rifle stock, and my left hand, so it's really a push-pull method. I'm pushing forward with my right hand, pulling in with my left hand, and that's what puts the pressure on the firearm. A lot of new shooters who might have grown up with guns, especially long gun shooters, shotgun shooters, hunters, they prefer this method because that's largely the stance you'd be using with a shotgun. That stance right here is less utilized, in modern shooting, especially in the modern shooting sports, because it's great if I'm going from here and then engaging a target over here, but if I'm trying to go the other way, I'm kind of stuck. I don't have a good way. If I'm in a good weaver stance, I don't have a good way to engage anything over here without completely turning. Whereas in a good isosceles stance, I can engage targets on all sides of my body without having to change my feet. It's just a much more pivotable stance, a far superior stance in my opinion. But those two stances, the isosceles and the weaver, are the two accepted stances that we teach.